Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming out in the rain, and welcome to tonight's sixth lecture in the League's series Towards a New Architecture, Climate Change and Design. I'm Rosalie Ginevra, Executive Director of the League, and I am really happy to welcome the stalwarts who've been here for all or most of the series, and also happy to see any of you who are here for your first dip into this series. Our purpose with Towards a New Architecture has been to shout out the need for urgent action on climate change by architects and others who create the built environment. Action that is required in the education of architects, in practice, in research, in local and national policies that regulate building, transportation, and planning. The speakers in this series have pointed toward pathways of action and indicated important lines of inquiry, but clearly we're not done. Making the fundamental changes required in the ways that we think about energy and materials and building demands continuing collective and individual work. The League has many resources available for you on our website, including material documenting our 5,000-pound life project, such as a brilliant lecture by Alice Larkin on air travel and sea shipping that was one of the rotating images, as well as a new set of interviews produced in parallel with this series. Soon after the first of the year, we'll be announcing next steps that we'll be taking, including new lecture series and other projects. I invite you to be in touch with us by email to let us know what you think would be most useful. One of the continuous threads through this series has been an emphasis on the importance of understanding buildings as dynamic rather than finite, and understanding that they are parts of much larger systems of energy and material flows. This idea has been at the core of David Benjamin's practice since he formed The Living in 2006. In a 2018 interview published in Architect magazine, he said, "I was interested in creating a version of interactive or responsive architecture, and that is connected over time to an interest in examining architecture through biology and actual living organisms. Those research topics are really related to ideas about expanding the definition of architecture. Maybe buildings are not just static, inert objects, but can be dynamic systems. Maybe they are not just dug into one site, but are actually connecting many different places." Those interests have played out over the years in an office that is equally focused on research and practice, and on a constant probing of the intersections between biology, computation, and design. David's an associate professor and director of the Advanced Design Studios at the Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation at Columbia, where he also recently was director of the GSAP Incubator at the New Museum. He organized the 2016 conference Embodied Energy and Design at GSAP, which was subsequently published by Lars Muller as the book Embodied Energy and Design, Making Architecture Between Metrics and Narratives. David and The Living have a long history with the Architectural League, too, as winners of the League Prize for Young Architects in 2006 and an Emerging Voice in 2014. In 2009, David and Natalie Jeremijenko were the co-authors of the project Amphibious Architecture, exploring issues of responsiveness, communication, and environmental quality, sponsored by the League as part of the 2009 exhibition Toward the Sentient City. Following David's lecture, he'll be joined on stage by Forrest Meggers. Forrest is an Iowan, trained as an environmental engineer, mechanical engineer, and architect, with a doctorate in architecture from the ETH in Zurich. He has a joint appointment at Princeton in the School of Architecture and the Endlinger Center for Energy and Environment. At Princeton, he founded and directs CHAOS Lab, which stands for Cooling and Heating for Architecturally Optimized Systems, whereas current areas of study include building systems thinking, radiant heating and cooling systems, geothermal and heat source and sink optimization, and low exergy air conditioning. So please join me in welcoming David Benjamin.
Well, thank you, Rosalie, for the introduction, and also, as you noted, for the League kind of tracking my career supporting our kind of experiments over many years now. It's been a great help to what we're thinking about. And I also want to thank the League for putting together this very important series. I think it can't be stated enough how important the topic is. And I also want to take this moment to thank the people that I work with every day. So in our studio, all of our work is collective, and these people shown here, plus probably some more, these people individually and collectively bring it to life. And I also want to mention that this is a new talk that I created for tonight. I think in the spirit of this series. So some aspects of the talk I'm showing for the first time. Many aspects may be a little rough, but in the spirit of this series, perhaps it's fitting to present content that is kind of provisional, that's work in progress, that's evolving, that's trying to respond to the deluge of news and details about the climate crisis. So my thinking for the talk as a whole is framed by this general context, and you already know a version of this story, I'm sure. By 2050, world population will increase by 3 billion people. This will require the construction of 13,000 buildings every day for the next 30 years. In addition, 400,000 people will enter the middle class every day. And of the 20 largest cities in the year 2050, 15 of them have yet to be built. Furthermore, as you probably know, buildings contribute about 40% of global carbon emissions, and concrete alone makes up about 8% of global carbon emissions. Yet, by many accounts, there is not even enough sand of the right type to make even the concrete foundations for all of these buildings of the next 30 years. In other words, it's impossible to think about the climate crisis without thinking about architecture and without thinking about scale. So it may be tempting to look for single changes to fix the problem. Technologies like carbon capture, shown here, or new ways of making concrete, getting rid of that 8% of carbon emissions, or low-cost solar and wind power, or even lifestyle shifts. But for one, there is a flaw in that science indicates that a single fix is impossible. Instead, we need what are called climate stabilization wedges, as Al Gore showed in his film Inconvenient Truth. But maybe more fundamentally, I think it's important to consider that a single technology and single technology fixes and even climate stabilization wedges should not be developed in isolation. And in fact, they may have some unintended consequences if we don't think them through carefully. So you may have read this same devastating story that I read about a year ago in the New York Times with the title, "Palm Oil was supposed to help save the planet. Instead, it unleashed a catastrophe." And I'll just summarize that story here. It's a story of a misguided United States policy that also became European policy to ramp up the use of vegetable oils, such as palm oil, in fuel, including gasoline, with the ambition of reducing carbon dioxide and curbing global warming. So palm oil trees grow in tropical climates, such as Indonesia, and each tree produces these 50-pound bunches of walnut-sized fruit that are full of an oil that's more versatile than almost any other plant-based oil. So the idea was to encourage the use of vegetable oils in fuel, and potentially by encouraging more palm oil production. But the laws that were drawn up very quickly, and they were based on an incomplete accounting of the true environmental costs of palm oil. So despite some warnings that the policies could have the opposite effect of their intended effect, they were implemented anyway, producing what now appears to be a calamity with global consequences. And this is because the tropical rainforests of Indonesia And in particular, the peatland regions of Borneo, where a lot of palm oil is being cultivated, have large amounts of carbon trapped within their existing trees, non-palm oil trees, and within the soil. So slashing and burning these existing forests to make way for the palm oil cultivation had a perverse effect. It released even more carbon than the carbon it was going to save through the vegetable oil and fuel. So instead of creating a clever technocratic fix to reduce the United States carbon footprint, lawmakers actually, in the words of the article, lit a fuse in a powerful carbon bomb that, as the forests were cleared and burned, produced more carbon than the entire continent of Europe. Indonesia then jumped to become the fourth largest emitter of carbon. The unprecedented palm oil boom, meanwhile, has enriched and emboldened many of the region's largest corporations, which have begun using their newfound power and wealth to suppress critics, abuse workers, and acquire more land to produce more oil. So I guess my point here is that instead of looking for single technology fixes and trying to design single technology fixes, I think what is more likely to address the problem, even if we're single-mindedly fixed on that problem, is to design new systems. And understanding, and this comes with understanding architecture itself as an open system. So I believe that as citizens and as architects, of course, we will have to become more literate in terms of the numbers, which actions and activities have which impact, what are the biggest levers, what are the sizes of the climate stabilization wedges. Along these lines, here's an article from the paper just yesterday, this is the Washington Post, describing how most people in the United States now accept climate science, but they have many wrong ideas about some of the causes. And here, if you look closely, on the kind of second line to the bottom, you can see how many people mistakenly believe that the sun getting hotter is a cause for climate change, or mistakenly think that cement manufacturing is not a major contributor to climate change. So in other words, we need to become more literate about the causes, the effects, the details, the science, and the numbers. We need to be able to answer questions like, what are the likely impacts of climate change beyond just rising sea levels? What does it mean to go from 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming to 2 degrees Celsius of warming? And along these lines, I strongly recommend this book. You may know about it already. Maybe you've read it, The Uninhabitable Earth by David Wallace Wells. This book, I think, is a powerful way to help us imagine and visualize the world that we're heading toward. But in addition to becoming more literate in terms of the numbers and the details, I think that as citizens and as architects, we all need to become more literate in terms of systems, in terms of unintended consequences, in terms of interconnected forces, in terms of compounding effects, in terms of cascading changes, both bad changes and good changes. And along these lines, I strongly recommend the second book, A Planet to Win, Why We Need a Green New Deal, to help us understand and think through the links between climate change and jobs and inequality, as well as to help us imagine bold and fair transformations and a low carbon world that might be possible and that also might leave no one behind, in the words of the Green New Deal. And in particular, I recommend checking out Daniel Aldana Cohen's architectural vision for 10 million beautiful public no-carbon homes to be constructed in the next 10 years. But all of this is to say that as architects and also as citizens, I think it's important for us to focus on whole systems instead of on single buildings. This is a kind of system diagram that we don't need to understand the details of, but just to get a sense of some of the interconnected forces and relationships in the biochemical pathways in what's going on in cells and biology. So systems we might look for that involve designing energy and materials and labor, as well as the typical form and function of a single building. And of course, thinking about architecture as a system is not new for the discipline. People like Howard Odum and Buckminster Fuller were advocating for holistic thinking many years ago, drawing some of the diagrams like this. And it's clear to me that, and to these precedent thinkers and designers, that architects have the potential to redesign systems that are much larger than buildings, systems that involve global flows of energy and raw materials, as Rosalie noted. And this actually suggests a redefinition of architecture. We could say that architecture should involve a longer duration and a wider geography, more time and more space than we typically consider. And we could imagine that architecture really is, at heart, an open system. And this kind of thinking about systems has been advanced more recently in other areas such as food. So the chef and writer Dan Barber explains how the initial framing of the farm-to-table movement, which he helped found, actually turned out to be wrong. And he writes, "Science teaches us that the answer to understanding the complexity of something is to break it into its component parts. It insists that things need to be precisely measured and weighed. But interactions and relationships cannot be measured or weighed. Our belief that we can create a sustainable diet for ourselves by cherry-picking great ingredients is wrong because it's too narrow-minded. We can't think about changing parts of our system. We need to think about redesigning the whole system." And as an example, Dan Barber picks wheat and describes how a New York farmer that he knows named Klaus Mertens grows a sustainable emmer wheat, and he has resurrected a lost flavor that has actually contributed to Barber's own cuisine and this cuisine that wins awards. So Barber continues by writing, "The secret to great tasting wheat is that it's not about the wheat, it's about the soil. Mertens designs the soil, not the wheat, and he does this through rotation farming and working with the larger system. By extension, we could say that it's important to simultaneously design all of these things at once: the grain, the soil, the food plate or the cuisine, and even new flavors. And perhaps for architecture, we could say that it's important, by extension, to design the material, the materials factory, the processes of the material, the building, and even new building typologies all at the same time. In this sense, architectural materials should no longer be considered static and permanent, but instead dynamic and continually transforming. And architects should take the initiative to actively design these kinds of transformations. In other words, to address the urban growth that I just described, single, fixed, solitary architecture projects won't cut it. The climate crisis gives us new urgency and new context to think about architecture as an open and dynamic system. And tonight I want to share several rough examples that I think may be relevant and instructive in this context. These examples are not perfect. In fact, some of them may be problematic in some ways. And I'm not an expert on all of these projects. So please forgive me if you already know these examples or you know some of the details better than I do. But I think what's important in these examples is actually the concept and the applicability of these projects to other projects, to the future, not exactly their specific details. In other words, I think these projects and examples are relevant provocations for the lecture series topic of climate change and design. And so this talk, the rest of my talk, is not meant to be a catalog of technologies or magic fixes, but rather it's meant to be a rough and incomplete field guide to new frameworks and new mindsets, and maybe to a set of approaches that architects and architecture students may want to interrogate further, to extend, and to use in a generative way in some of their own work. So I'll show 11 quick examples here. The first one is biomaterials. So wood is probably the most famous biomaterial. And as we heard from Alan earlier in the lecture series, mass timber offers a very interesting and scalable approach to the buildings of the future. Yet there are a range of other biomaterials that are also renewable, low in carbon, and low in waste. And at the Living, in my own design studio, we've experimented with materials that are grown from the root-like structure of mushrooms called mycelium. We began here by thinking of a system of architectural materials and its relationship to the Earth's carbon cycle, the endless loop of growth and decay and regrowth and transformation of carbon. And starting with this concept, we had the idea that maybe we could take low-value raw materials, in other words, take waste, spend a small amount of energy converting those raw materials into building blocks, make some kind of building or structure, and at the end of the useful life of that structure, take all of that stuff, all of that physical matter, all the materials of the building, and return them back to the carbon cycle. And the way we set out to do this was with living organism and grown materials. So here is the branching structure of mycelium shown in a microscope video. And it turns out if you combine mycelium with agricultural waste, so not the high-value part of agriculture, for example, not corn kernels, but the low-value part of agriculture, just chopped up corn stover, combine mycelium and this agricultural waste, put it in a mold of almost any shape, and as you can see here, in about 5 days, it grows into a solid object, which could be used for a number of different design applications. So our collaborator, this great company in upstate New York called Ecovative, is using this material as a replacement for styrofoam in packaging. And our idea was to see if we could use it for a new kind of architectural brick. And of course, we had to do a lot of testing. And here we were working with another collaborator, the Strength of Materials Lab at Columbia University, also with some structural engineers at Arup. Testing single bricks, small assemblies of bricks. And here we are building a test of the project in the courtyard of MoMA PS1. So we thought of the project as a medium-scale test of this biomaterial, this low-carbon material. So it was about 40 feet tall, in other words, more than one story as a test, and it was made of about 10,000 bricks. So in other words, more bricks than we could create, in our own studio, on a lab bench, or in a small maker space. But the project was not only an experiment with a new material, the project also involved a multifaceted engagement with people and other aspects of architecture as a system. It offered a direct relationship to regional agriculture, where the raw materials came from, and also innovation culture, the startup company, Ecovative, that we worked with. It offered a relationship to municipal artists and nonprofits, and also to local community gardens. People working on the project included local artists, local trade school interns from the Brooklyn Navy Yard, international graduate students from Columbia, construction professionals, engineering professionals, and also people from nonprofits such as the Brooklyn Grange. And all people involved in the project, so as we were engaging a kind of labor, even in this experiment, were meaningfully engaged and fairly paid. The project also engaged a diverse public through its high-profile installation at a museum. And considering the project as an example of this idea of architecture as an open system, the project involved multiple sites, multiple scales, multiple collaborators, and maybe most essentially, multiple timescales. Because at the end of the summer, we took apart the structure, crumbled the bricks into smaller pieces, combined these pieces with yet other living organisms in terms of worms and bacteria. And in about 60 days, all of the bricks, the entire structure was returned to soil through composting, which we gave for New York City tree planting and also for local community gardens, in essence, showing that this was a non-toxic enough material that it could in turn be eaten. And so for our design studio, the project involved not only a kind of strange test of a new material, but also tools and insights and approaches that we think can be reused on other projects in the future. So in other words, can help us when thinking about architecture as a system to not start every project from scratch. Along these lines, I think it's interesting to note that 3M, the large materials company, which is actually known for inventing things like the Post-it and Scotch tape and using a lot of petrochemicals. But 3M is investing heavily in mycelium materials, which is a whole other topic, but I think it's interesting to note their reasoning, or at least their stated reasoning. They think that mycelium materials can be a materials platform like plastics. In other words, we know that plastics can make materials that are like fabric, and they're flexible, or they can make material that's hard and rigid. There are materials in plastics that are foam-like and lightweight, also materials that are dense. And at 3M and many other biologists and scientists think that mycelium materials might be able to offer a similar materials platform, a substitute for our reliance on petroleum-based materials. But I think along these lines, maybe we could say that with systems, a change in one element makes you rethink many other elements. And a mycelium brick is not only a replacement for a clay brick or a concrete brick, it's also a new type of brick and a new way of thinking about materials themselves. As a biomaterial, mycelium bricks have a different relationship to resources, and they also have different physical properties. More specifically, a mycelium brick can be a living material with some of the properties of other living organisms, like growing and self-healing. So for a new series of projects that we've been doing recently with mycelium materials, we developed the potential, or explored the potential, to create a living material that would bind to itself, essentially being brick and mortar in the same material because it's a living material. And we called this process biowelding. You can see a close-up of that here. So the first project that I'll show that we have done recently with this material and this new approach involved a small test of assembly of this kind of self-binding material, these units. So in other words, we made units, spherical units, of two types. One was a mycelium type of unit, another was a wood type of unit, and we developed a logic for stacking them where we knew that mycelium units would bond to mycelium units would also bond to wood units because they like the cellulose in wood, but wood units would not bond to wood units, as we all know. So you can use a kind of scaffolding and maybe a new way of thinking about the logic of 3D printing to create a kind of structure that binds together and can create new kinds of forms and spaces. So we continued this exploration of this kind of biowelding at a larger scale. So here are some units that are kind of the size of buckets. In fact, we made them through buckets. And this time we used a different kind of assembly logic, and this is an approach called jamming. It basically comes from the idea that different units, say imagine grains of sand, have different ways of layering when you pour them in a pile. So if you have spherical sand and you pour it in a pile, it creates a very flat pile. If you have more angular sand, it creates a slightly steeper pile. And if the units themselves are kind of like tetrapods or very have a lot of interior spaces, then you could create even shapes almost like a wall out of just pouring units. So we explored this idea at a kind of scale model idea, a scale model shape, and came up with some ways to pour more or less bricks or blocks into a formwork instead of laying blocks one by one and putting mortar in between them. So we scaled up a little bit. Here's a quarter scale test of the use of jamming, and here we now switched to using mycelium material. And then we created a kind of prototype, again, of large-scale architecture, medium-scale architecture, for an installation at the Pompidou Center that was about the new possibilities of combining biology and design. So with our testing, which I described, of using the jamming process, using the biowelding process, we created a bunch of units. We used standard buckets as molds. We grew these bucket-shaped bricks and kept the bricks alive, so this is a living material, unlike our installation at Vietnam, where we dried out the materials. We created a formwork.
Like, might happen, but most likely.
And basically poured in these living bricks into the formwork. Then we removed basically the bottom of the mold, as if you have a funnel and you're removing the bottom of a funnel. And when we pulled out the loose bottom layer of the bricks, we got this shape of an arch, basically. The pressing of the material into the mold created this jamming shape of an arch, and then we allowed the material to bind to itself in this process of biowelding with the living material. And then we removed the rest of the formwork and saw that we, could create a new kind of architecture scale prototype with a new material, a new method of assembly, and exploring what might be possible when you think of not just replacing a brick one for one, a new low carbon brick for a high carbon cement brick, but allowing that the new material might have new properties and new possibilities. So the last thing I'm going to show for this example is that in addition to wood and mycelium as biomaterials, low carbon materials, I want to describe this other example of a biomaterial that's called bacterial cellulose. So in this project by Chris Gardner, a former student of mine at Columbia GSAP, he experimented with this kind of material that can, in essence, be grown by adding sugar to a tea-like liquid and then allowing a thin film to grow on top of the liquid, grabbing that film out of the liquid, drying it out, and using it as a kind of architectural material that can be grown quickly from sugar at a very low cost. Here's some additional experiments with the material, thinking of filling it with the kind of insulation or other ways to have a multi-step process. When you have this wet biomaterial that's going to dry, you can embed certain things in it. Here's a range of different possibilities that Chris came up with. And again, it was important for Chris to think of these materials themselves as systems. The raw materials came from a specific place. In this case, in Chris's project, sugarcane came from Brazil. They were transported and manufactured in specific ways, in this case, on site near the agricultural fields. And there was a specific kind of labor involved, multiple jobs by local and international people. So Chris, in other words, designed the whole system, all of these aspects, not just the material, not just the architecture, but the whole ecosystem and the whole potential new future. Here's a little bit from Chris's project statement. He says, "The coming biological age offers us an opportunity to reassess the notion of sustainable design. For my building," this is Chris speaking, "research complex in the sugarcane fields outside of Campinas, Brazil, I've employed the grown material of bacterial cellulose. In order to engage the manifold issues of incorporating a new technology and material politics, I have created a series of narratives for 7 different actors." So Chris continues, "These narratives inform the design of the building, each with their own set of representative media. We are all complicit in the Anthropocene, but rather than eschewing our current systems, we should evolve our individual roles to accommodate a greater ecology. So I should also note that this was a project that was a winner of a prize offered by the Buell Center and directed by Reinhold Martin at Columbia GSAP, which is a prize that's called the Paris Prize that's designed to encourage student projects to address the climate crisis and the spirit of the Paris Agreement. Okay, number 2, embodied energy. And some of these approaches I'm going to describe in more length than others, so some of them will go much quicker. Embodied energy is a measurement and a concept that can help us see the systems involved in architectural materials. And as Rosalie mentioned, this is a subject that we have explored at Columbia GSAP in a multi-year research project, a symposium, and a book. And the book has great contributions, and also the symposium had great contributions from a wide variety of people, including architects, engineers, material scientists, historians, and curators, and also including Michelle Addington, Anna Dyson, Kiel Moe, and Forrest Meggers, who have all been part of this event series. The research, in a way, begins where I began the lecture with the well-known fact and facts that buildings account for 1/3 or more of global waste, energy consumption, and carbon emissions. But what may be less well known is that embodied energy, defined as the energy required to extract, produce, transport, and assemble materials into buildings, embodied energy has been increasing dramatically over time. In fact, by 2050, 1/3 of global carbon emissions, and by rough association, 1/3 of global energy consumption will come from making, not operating, our buildings and cities. This means that although embodied energy is invisible, it is a very big deal. And energy consumption is maybe just one of the important invisible consequences of making buildings. Another consequence is the mobilization of labor, as the advocacy group Who Builds Your Architecture has emphasized. This is their diagram in the upper left. And clearly, embodied energy and these other invisible forces are important to address, but they're also difficult to address. Where exactly is all of the embodied energy? What are the forces and interests involved? What is left out of the equation? How is embodied energy actionable? And how might architects design with it? How might they draw it? So in the Embodied Energy Pilot Project and also in the publication, we started by drawing data visualizations. So here we're breaking down embodied energy by materials, such as aluminum and glass. We're also breaking it down by building systems, for example, structure and envelope, and by phase of architecture, such as extraction and transportation. And we're comparing buildings in case studies, as well as translating their impact, the impact of buildings and the embodied energy in buildings, to other kinds of impact. For example, cars taken off the road or pounds of oil burned. But after these data visualizations, we quickly realized that the data was not enough. We also needed to understand the qualitative and relational aspects of embodied energy. So we moved to drawing material stories, the narrative of a material like concrete or wood or steel, from extraction to factory production to transportation to construction. So this is, in a way, a new kind of system diagram that shows the qualitative as well as the quantitative features of these material systems. And we also use this kind of system thinking to open up questions rather than deliver answers. So at each of the sites involved in the production of architectural materials, including extraction, factory production, transportation, et cetera, at each of these sites, we started to ask questions about what was going on, about what the impacts were, about what were some of the invisible forces at play, using drawing to open up questions rather than just deliver a known answer. And ultimately, I think this project and the framework of embodied energy is an exploration of the complexity of the systems involved in architecture. And it's exploring that from a variety of perspectives. But maybe more than that, the book and the project are a lens through which we might see all kinds of invisible but essential features of architecture, such as embodied water, embodied carbon, and embodied labor. And it may allow us as architects to discover and search for new ways of building, but also new forms of creativity. 3, substituting manpower for energy. So again, thinking about systems, it matters where the energy came from. So in architectural materials, of course it matters how much energy, but it also matters where the energy comes from. For example, solar power to make steel is better than coal power to make steel, although it's important to understand the whole ecosystem of power generation. And it also matters what kind of human labor is involved, as I mentioned previously. One fascinating framework for combining energy and labor comes from almost 50 years ago. In 1973, a young Swiss architect named Walter Stayhill was working on a study for the Commission of the European Communities and searching for ways to save large amounts of energy in the construction industry. So part of the same problem we're working on now. Instead of looking at technologies such as more efficient lighting or cooling, Stayhill actually turned to behavior patterns and socioeconomic issues. In explaining his line of thinking, he noted that some of our major problems are interlinked and cannot be solved one by one. Stayhill and his collaborator, Genevieve Reddy-Mulvey, eventually reached the conclusion that these problems could be best addressed by substituting manpower for energy. That's their words. In a report called Jobs for Tomorrow, they wrote, "The creation of new skilled jobs can be achieved in parallel with a considerable reduction of energy consumption through what they call a prolongation of the useful life of materials and products." So Stayhill and Reddy-Mulvey called this prolongation reconditioning, and they had in mind repairing and tuning up cars, as well as renovating and adaptively reusing buildings. So it's some of the same thinking that's within the Green New Deal. Furthermore, the report emphasized that the jobs created by this kind of reconditioning work would actually be meaningful and fulfilling jobs. Stayhill and Reddy-Mulvey's line of thinking itself was not new. All accounts of industrialization, of course, involved the increase in productivity due to machines taking over the labor of humans, which translates to machines consuming energy to do work instead of humans consuming food to do work. But it was refreshing for these writers to suggest that this trend could be selectively reversed through humans taking back some work from machines. Although it was not new, this articulation was eventually influential, and Stayhill extended it to the actionable mantra of reduce, reuse, recycle, the concept of cradle to cradle, and the framework of a circular economy, all of which inform our current understanding of climate change and design, as well as architecture as open system. 4, public works for a Green New Deal. So this is the kind of framework, substituting manpower for energy, if we call it that. It's the kind of framework that might require policy to address. And there are a lot of interesting efforts currently along these lines. Building code and sustainability certifications such as LEED are examples of a kind of policy, and so is the Green New Deal. This semester at Columbia GSAP, the Buell Center for the Study of American Architecture, directed by Reinhold Martin, organized an initiative called Public Works for a Green New Deal. It's a collection of classes at Columbia GSAP as well as events, and the classes are across all programs, and they address the policy proposal in the United States known as the Green New Deal. These classes and events investigate the intersection of climate change inequality, combining a commitment to rapid decarbonization of the country with a commitment to leave no one behind. Here are a sampling of some of the advanced studios at Columbia GSAP that are engaging this topic. And within this framework of public works for a Green New Deal, my own studio adds two kind of hypotheses that deal a little bit with this idea of architecture as system. So the first is Climate Design Corps. In the spirit of the Civilian Conservation Corps, the Peace Corps, and AmeriCorps, the studio imagined a new, what we're calling a Climate Design Corps, taking a critical look at the earlier models and reinventing them in the context of public works for a Green New Deal. Like its predecessors, our Corps called upon young people to commit to a year of service, to work together in teams, to receive training for meaningful jobs, and to work for the public good. Similar to many of the individual AmeriCorps programs, our Corps emphasized diversity of participants and promoted social equality through collaboration. But our Corps was more environment-focused than AmeriCorps and more design-focused than any of the precedent corps. So the second topic was low-carbon materials, which I've already talked about in the beginning. In addition to inventing a new climate corps, this studio focused on low-carbon materials. We studied biomaterials like bricks made of bacteria and sand, and here I'm thinking of Ginger Dossier and her company Biomason, as well as carbon sequestering wood, repurposed materials, prefabrication, and buildings as material depots. Operating at multiple scales, we created materials, designed new buildings and infrastructure, and developed new systems for material flow and life cycle impact. We explored the interconnections of low-carbon materials with some of the Green New Deal's most radical and challenging aims, such as upgrading every building in the United States, reviving domestic manufacturing, designing and constructing 10 million no-carbon public homes, prolonging the useful life of objects and buildings through work in design and repair, promoting community-defined projects and strategies, inventing new ways of living, and creating meaningful jobs from design through construction. Part of the process of the studio here in thinking about architecture as an open system was for students to simultaneously design a building and also a policy that would make that building possible. What would it take to make a dent in the massive problems of carbon and inequality? In addition, almost all projects were funded by the government as part of the Green New Deal in a kind of transformation of the way that many architecture studios are outlined these days. So to give you a sense of some of the projects, which are works in progress, the students are wrapping up as we speak. The projects include explorations in design for disassembly, the idea of a zero waste Manhattan, nothing leaves the island, redrawing the flood risk map to account for social equality and the ability of different people to rebuild after a disaster, focusing on those qualities in addition to the elevation above sea level. Rewilding the city. This is related to the E.O. Wilson concept of half-Earth. Creating housing for climate migrants, both domestic and international. And you probably know and have read that the UN estimates there might be as many as 1 billion climate refugees if we get to high levels of warming. Bioconcrete manufacturing to transform this material, concrete, that makes up 8% of global carbon emissions. And finally, transforming the architecture profession itself and architectural labor with an open source ethos and 3 types of architectural licenses instead of 1. 5, pledging. So collective action is a kind of system thinking as well. The Paris Agreement and some earlier precedents of global action, for example, to ban chlorofluorocarbons and protect the ozone layer, those are examples of this kind of collective action. And I think we could say that action is more powerful and effective when it's coordinated. The same is true for climate change and design, climate change and architecture. Coordinated design action is necessary. And we've seen a range of pledges recently related to sustainable and carbon neutral architecture from countries as part of the Paris Agreement, from states, New York State included, from cities, New York City included, from building owners and also architecture firms, engineering firms, and even contractors. These pledges range from individual kind of declarations, like the firm Snøhetta just announced, to collectives, to the idea that has gained a lot of momentum in the UK under an organization called Construction Declares or Architecture Declares, where many UK architecture firms and also UK engineers have made a kind of pledge to address this problem in some way. So I want to note that as with sustainability certification standards like LEED, these pledges may be flawed. We all like to talk about how LEED could be improved or the flaws of LEED, and I think that's important. But I think these pledges do offer a powerful framework for discussion. They bring together people for a common standard, a common ground of discussing what's important, how to declare what our goals should be, a framework for discussion, debate, and critique, as well as for coordinated action. And I think this trend is powerful and important. 6, divesting. Divesting is perhaps the biggest lever of all in systems thinking about architecture and climate change. And by that I mean divesting from fossil fuels. So it's a statement that is not generally part of the architecture discourse. I think it's not on the agenda for Architecture Declares or Snøhetta's pledge, but I think it's important to stake out that ground. And it's important to look for examples of this kind of divestment. So there are pension funds that have started divesting, including cities and cities' finances that have started divesting. There are a number of nonprofits that are divesting, and we have universities as well that are starting to divest. I think this is an important lever, and it's important to recognize the importance of divesting from fossil fuels as a course of action, as a possibility, as a design move. But it also raises an interesting framework. We can divest from fossil fuels, and we should, but we can also divest from or say no to a number of other things, including certain types of projects, certain types of clients, certain types of programs, et cetera. And divesting can be a design action itself when we think about architecture as an open system. 7, cultivating buildings. So I've described a series of different kind of high-level strategies, but what does this mean for architecture? Let's bring it back to architecture and architecture projects. How do we deal with climate change at the building scale, we might ask? What does architecture as an open system mean for specific buildings? And one example that I think is very relevant and interesting dates back thousands of years, actually. This is a drawing from the town of Djenne in central Mali, with the current population of about 30,000 people. This town was founded between 800 and 1250. And the historic town itself dates back to the 14th century. And maybe more relevantly, its famous mud mosque in the center of town is its most important building. It's the kind of prototype for all of the architecture of the town, and it's in its 3rd reconstruction. So legend says that the original Great Mosque, shown here, was erected in the 13th century. The second mosque was built between 1834 and 1836. And the current structure was built as a kind of replica with the same materials in 1907. It's actually the largest mud-built structure in the world. Here's another view. And the process for making this building, making this structure, involved baking mud and straw bricks in the sun so baking but in the sun, not with carbon emissions, stacking them to create walls, then plastering the walls with mud for smooth surface and more stability. And the labor is performed by local masons, local experts in this material and process. But if the replastering does not reoccur, or if replastering does not occur often, the exterior walls start degrading and almost melting away in the rainy season. So every year during the annual festival of the Great Mosque, the entire city gets together to replaster the exterior. I'll give you a sense of that in this video. Oops, I was going to show this next video. So in these festivals, we see the masons mixing tons of mud, rice husks, and water to form the bricks to do this work. It's a kind of social event. Musicians play drums and flutes, and that's used to kind of accompany the labor and motivate the workers in some way. Maybe I think most relevant for thinking about this as a prototype, the buildings are kind of envisioned as a social structure and as a physical object to be kind of tended as a plant, as a living plant, for example, rather than as a dead static object that will just sit dormant and unchanged for years and years. We know that all of architecture changes over time, degrades, gets old, needs renovation. But as architects, we often don't design for that. And especially, we often don't design with that in mind. We don't deliberately design a structure that should be renovated. More often, we might design something to be durable for the ages. So I think this is a fascinating example that, like many of the examples, could be drawn from and recombined, even if we're not using this exact material, even if we're not making. Okay, I'm getting toward the end here. I want to cover a few more things. Another interesting approach, I think, in thinking about architecture as an open system is long-term thinking. So perhaps the most famous advocate of long-term thinking, at least who's still alive,
Gregory Bateson used to tell the story of the oak beams of New College, Oxford. This is how it went. New College was founded in the late 14th century. It had, like other colleges at Oxford, a great dining hall with oak beams across the top. These might be 2 feet square, 40 feet long. A century ago, some busy entomologist poked at the beams and discovered that they were full of beetles. This was reported to the college council, who met in some dismay, because where would they find beams of that caliber nowadays? One of the junior fellows stuck his neck out and suggested there might be some oak on the college lands. So they called in the college forester, who of course had not been near the college for years, and asked him about oak. And he pulled his forelock and said, "Well, sirs, we was wondering when you'd be asking." On further inquiry, it was discovered that when the college was founded, a grove of oaks had been planted to replace the beams in the college hall when they became beetly, because oak beams always become beetly in the end. This plan had been passed down from one forester to the next for 500 years. You don't cut them oaks, them's for the college hall. A nice story. That's the way to run a culture. My friend Greg.
Okay. So it turns out, as he mentioned in the beginning, whatever you think of Stuart Brand, that he actually probably got this story from the anthropologist Gregory Bateson. And it also turns out, fast forwarding a little bit, that the former UK Prime Minister David Cameron retold this story as an example of long-term planning in government. But it also turns out that the story is probably a myth. An archivist of Oxford College named Jennifer Thorpe pointed out that the forest in the story was actually acquired by the college 70 years after the original hall was constructed. And the roof of the hall had actually already been rebuilt once in 1786 using pitch pine timbers because large oak timber was apparently unavailable at the time. But I guess I would like to ask whether the details of the story really matter. Because one might say that what's important is the idea, whether or not it was used on this project. And actually, along these lines, maybe we could think of these ideas and these narratives of ideas as themselves being open systems, as being something to be designed within architecture. And they're passed between people and used and reclaimed and remixed and changed. And I think what's important is to think about the idea itself. Number 9, design for disassembly. So the idea of planting trees for use hundreds of years in the future is related to a kind of contemporary idea of buildings as material resource banks. So here's a project called Brooman Town Hall. It's a renovation of a historic structure in the middle by Rao Architects. And this project involved the necessity to create a temporary structure. The town wanted a 20-year building because they thought that it might be incorporated into another town in the future, and they might want to preserve the ability to do something else with the historic structure. And so the architects basically decided that they wanted to make an agreement with the materials manufacturer to take back the beams and columns after 20 years. And they had an interesting discussion with the manufacturer and determined that actually it would be best for the reuse of the beams and columns if they were oversized or sized in a more standard way, in a way that they could be valuable to the material manufacturer when they took them back. And again, beyond this specific project, I think this is an interesting concept and provocation that we might design the end of life or design the disassembly or even design the decay and decomposition of our buildings and building materials. And there are obviously design strategies to achieve this. This is related to an idea that's been advocated by the same firm, which is which they basically call material passports. And the idea here is that materials, like people, could come with a passport that traces their history, not only their origins, but the places they've been. And the kind of framing idea here is that material without an identity, so material without a passport, is waste. And I guess the converse would be true in the argument. So if we can give these materials an identity, allow for a kind of inventory of what's in a building, allow materials to be more or less checked in and checked out. This is from one of their kind of promotion videos. Then maybe we would kind of provoke a new way of thinking, a new way of manufacturers thinking about buildings, building owners thinking about buildings, architects thinking about buildings, and kind of change the whole system, the whole mindset. So they've created a tool that could help with this new mindset. And finally, and this is the last project that I'll show, I wanted to show how we've applied some of these strategies and some of this thinking in an experimental project which does not directly try to reduce carbon emissions, but I think might be relevant in a broader sense when thinking about climate change and effects like biodiversity and the kind of future of the built environment relating to the natural world. So this is a project that in some ways begins with a physical material and in another way begins with new ideas about the relationship of architecture to public health. It's a collaboration, as many of our projects are, with two good friends and colleagues, in this case, Kevin Slavin and Elizabeth Henoff, and it builds off some amazing work that they have already done and others have already done at the intersection of biology and cities. So we started here with the hypothesis that just as we are increasingly aware of the bacteria in our own bodies and the way a gut microbiome contributes to our individual health, maybe an urban microbiome could contribute to our collective health. In other words, microbes, or bacteria and other kinds of microbes, are all around us, even though they're invisible. They're in the air, on our food, and on our architecture. And contrary to many 20th century thoughts and design concepts about the dangers of disease and the corresponding benefits of sterile environments with no life at all, we now know that most microbes actually help keep us alive. So in this context, for this project, which was an installation at Storefront for Art and Architecture, not far from where we are now, we set out to explore this in two ways, maps and models. For maps, we were measuring the microbiome in a gallery in Soho and comparing it to the microbiome in places like the Brooklyn Navy Yard. And for models, we were exploring design scenarios for architecture that actually promotes microbial life. And we were thinking about whether something like a probiotic architecture might be able to improve public health. To do this, we developed a bioreceptive material to catch and host microbes. And the material we started with, obviously, was wood. Wood is well suited for hosting microbial life based on its molecular composition and its micro and macro shapes. And for this project in the Storefront gallery space, we transformed the panels of the facade with wood tiles cut from standard lumber and deliberately eroded through sandblasting at various depths to create diverse microclimates. Each microclimate has distinct grain and knots from the wood itself that create different pockets of shade and moisture. And this allows us to see that even the most humble and common building material, like a cheap 4x4 post of Douglas fir, has a material story behind it to be uncovered that may offer a range of visible and invisible effects. So it's kind of digging into the system of the material itself. In terms of physical materials, with the building envelope of this kind of bioreceptive wood designed to host microbial life, architecture can become a kind of sensor for the urban microbiome. And for the second part of the project, in terms of living materials, we set up a lab in order to sequence DNA on site. So here are the basic steps. First, swab the sandblasted wood tiles from each location, here at Storefront, but also at the Brooklyn Navy Yard and other places, to collect the microbes living on the surface. Second, place the swab in a liquid solution and agitate it to break down the cell walls. Third, separate the DNA from other substances. Fourth, add marker beads to the end of the DNA fragments and produce a pure DNA solution. Fifth, load the DNA solution into a flow cell to be processed by a portable DNA sequencer. Sixth, the sequencer converts electrical charge into sequence data, the ATCG of genetic code. And then finally, after we sequenced the data from each location, we designed a system to automatically draw the output as an early and rough map to an uncharted territory. This map is raw and is at a coarse resolution, but it allowed us to start seeing some interesting things. For example, in the Brooklyn Navy Yard, we saw microbial DNA that performs the function of breaking down heavy metals, which indicates that the Navy Yard has specific pollutants that were not found in Soho. And overall for this project, we were imagining architecture as a broader system. We're using the gallery installation as an active living experiment. We're exploring a new architectural envelope and a new way of seeing some of the important matter and organisms that help keep us alive as humans. We're looking at materials and their layers of living matter, looking at waste and its microscopic scale, looking at a version of multi-species architecture, designing not only for humans, but for other species and for biodiversity, which we as humans ultimately depend on. We're reframing buildings themselves as stewards for the urban microbiome. And the initial evidence indicates that our collective future, our future in relation to climate change and design, the future of the built environment, the future of all humans plus all non-human animals and all microbes, is probably a lot more collective and interdependent than any of us can see or imagine. Thank you. Hello, Forrest.
I am from Iowa, so you get a hug. Good to see you. Good to see you. All right. Thanks so much for the talk. Thanks everybody for coming out. I guess where I wanted to start was, since at the very beginning you sort of took me back home. Right before I came back to the US to start my role at Princeton, I was in Singapore breathing all the smoke of burning palm plantations. So I thought it was really interesting to contextualize the talk at the beginning from this 5,000 feet view of some of these big challenges that we face. And I was wondering maybe if you could reflect on a wonderful series of important perspectives on the challenges that architecture creates, rather than sort of the perspective of, as architects and engineers, as I am also, we tend to solve problems rather than address challenges. And I think in many of the examples you gave, the solutions that we create often contain within them so many other unresolved and highly complex challenges within them and problems within them that we still have to address. So maybe the palm plantation is a specific place to start, but in the context of the way wedges are framed in terms of carbon, maybe those are some of the things, the theme of this climate crisis maybe reframed as sort of a carbon crisis, a material crisis that can be addressed through differentiation in process. I don't know if that's how do you contextualize sort of some of the fundamental pieces that motivate the work with like all of the challenges that are sort of inherently, you expose them, but then you yourself are exposed to them in doing that, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think we're going to have to get used to uncertainty and imperfection. So while it is important to understand the whole system, to raise questions about unintended consequences, to pull a lot of people into the room to discuss it, to have diverse stakeholders, to be critical of certain technocratic fixes, we also can't afford to wait, and we have to act in some ways. And we're going to have to, I think, argue through whether to compromise or, what is our best chance of success here. Because, ultimately, it doesn't need to be spoken in this room really, but we have a running clock, right? The time is running out to avoid the irreversible effects. And the palm oil story, as I understand it, again, I'm no expert in some of these stories I'm telling here, but that's just so frustrating because there were people telling the policymakers, you're doing it wrong, you're counting it wrong. And so it wasn't one of those problems like nobody had any idea. It was something that, should have been stopped, could have been stopped.
Yeah, exactly. I think that the palm oil story is one that I think maybe can situate our discussion here briefly on what the concept that I like to call the time value of carbon. So like the time value of money is something that we discuss a lot with economists, and I recently had a conversation with Tim Searchinger's a professor in the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton, a policy-oriented thinker, and he gets in trouble a lot for criticizing biofuels. And one of the ways he does that is by saying, you know what matters right now is whether we're emitting carbon right now. And one of the challenges for architecture is if we go and say we're going to build in the public works for the Green New Deal, we're going to build 10 million new no-carbon homes. And in your mind, you're going to visualize a building with solar panels on it. But the solar panels on the building have not reduced any carbon emissions. In fact, they've emitted enough carbon that they will take them 7 years to mitigate the amount of carbon it took to make them. And the moment we build a building, we've actually created lots of emissions, even if it's a zero carbon building. I think there's where, like, when we really start to think about the material dynamics that you sort of expose through experimentation, we have to unpack a lot more that is contained within that challenge, which becomes, for me, sometimes overly daunting. And so then we retreat into the specifics rather than this larger challenge. And maybe one of the cliches is the most sustainable building is the building we don't build. But I mean, there's something to be said for design for deconstruction, and sort of, we are moving in that direction, but in what ways do you register or contemplate this sort of challenge of the inherent costs that you have to pay just by building a building in the context of the time value of carbon having a value now to not emit carbon now, and then down the road, it's going to have, you know, certain paybacks, and whether we act now or in the future is not something that we have explicit control over really in the present. So I have a hard time with the large-scale urban system and rethinking it, but I think you're presenting a path forward, and I'm optimistic, but I'm curious what your design, how your design process is filtered by that sort of larger, sometimes pessimistic, but I think contains still design opportunities in there that you're executing. What are some of those? And I don't know how to, I'm sorry.
Yeah. Well, I do think we need to prioritize, right? So we need to have discussions like, are we going to prioritize, you know, mitigation? Or are we just going to resolve that we have to work on adaptation? I mean, that's part of the common language of this climate change discussion, right? And I think I am already of the belief that we can't have it all. I mean, that we should immediately start pursuing some of the strategies that some of my students are proposing, and it's so brilliant and simple, but I mean, obviously complicated, but we should all live in half the number of square feet. So, you know, I talked about how we need 13,000 buildings every day for the next 30 years. That has been haunting me for a year. But if we all lived more modestly, lived in fewer square feet, rearranged the way we think of public space and private space, then maybe we would need 6,500 buildings a day. I mean, that would be big, right? So I think we should be talking about not necessarily the radical fixes like, you know, those carbon gobbling fan-based machines, which I do think should be explored, but can't be the savior. But I think radical ideas like we should live with less consumption, we should live smaller, we should reuse buildings and building materials. I think all of that has to be on the table. I mean, this idea that we're going to know is crazy. We already know it's crazy to think we can keep living the way we are living now. Mm-hmm. And it's just an illusion no matter what, right? Because even if we keep doing what we're doing now, mm-hmm. then all of those problems of drought, inequality, migration, food shortages, they're coming anyway. So we're gonna have to change whether we like it or not. I mean, it's a non-economic view of the same idea that like, if we had started 10 years ago, we would have only had to invest 2% of GDP, but now we have to invest like 7%. And if we wait another year, it's gonna be like 9%. Those numbers may not be accurate, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, no.
So I think we need to get people around the table to be realistic.
Yeah, and I think then the question becomes, what is the way that what is the execution that you envision makes that happen? I mean, you have to be proactive and take action, and I think architects, for good or for bad, are in charge of a huge portion of how that execution plays out, right? And I guess I'll take you back to your divesting comment.
Yeah, or the pledging, right?
Yeah, so I mean, and I mean, when I first arrived at Princeton, the first meeting I went to was one trying to convince them to divest from all their fossil fuel investments, right? But I think that's external to me. I can come into Princeton and be like, yeah, Princeton, stop doing that, right? But as a professional now, and when you're engaging in the built sector and the built environment that we're not all now agreeing is complicit in a huge fraction of the future impact that we have to manage and mitigate, it's hard because then it's more like you're cutting your own, you're criticizing yourself, and what are the steps maybe, because you alluded to a couple, but I think the important thing is how do you frame it in a positive light going forward, and I think that is because architecture has creativity behind it, that solving problems and finding solution is a part of it, and it's not necessarily just, it can no longer really be solely driven by a creativity that's not informed by some piece of analytical nature. So I mean, I don't necessarily think that that has to do with giving up any of the design process or divesting the creative part of it, but it does involve reframing it. And maybe you can give us some, I mean, you've definitely done that to some extent. And maybe it'd be interesting to hear you, were there any pain points? Because one of my big comments to my students is always, when I'm teaching them technical things, is you shouldn't think of this as a constraint, right? There's this, you always think of the technical things as limits. If I tell you, you have to have so much air in this room and you have to reduce the energy in your building, those are viewed as constraints. But I think a lot of the ways that you're working through these problems, especially on the material side, which, as we said earlier, is a part we often overlook, the fact that the solar panels have a huge impact that have to be mitigated. How has that maybe, as a process, been productive because it enables maybe, instead of a constraint, flipping that and turning it into an opportunity or a instigation, right, for shifting paradigms, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great point that the constraints can often be your best friend as a designer, because they take you into new possibilities, and that's the most fun part of design anyway, and where the best design comes out of. But that avoids the friction, I mean, that I think it's important to talk about, because, I mean, yeah, architecture is complicit. As a practicing architect, all of us are complicit. The work that I do, some of it's complicit. And that's where I think, I don't know, maybe the pledges are really interesting and attractive to me. I don't think they've got it yet. They're not pledging the right thing. They're a little too vague. But I do think they could serve a nice role of mobilizing us all together. Like, what could we do? Let's all pledge and then argue about like what we should be putting in our statement. Because if all the architects in the UK refused to work on a certain kind of project, that'd be powerful, right? You can change things quickly. One of the best things I learned about the framework of the Green New Deal is how in history things have, when we look back at the New Deal, some things changed really quickly. And we can mobilize. And so maybe the power of design then, if you kind of follow that, is not like creatively trying to solve the low carbon problem and just kind of redirecting the effort from like making a great form to making a low-carbon building. Maybe instead design is to show the way to something that's like really important, like divesting, or making a more ambitious pledge goal of all architects. Like to basically tell that story. Again, of all the examples I show, I'm interested in like who can tell the story that's powerful. And it's like, it's easy to laugh at Stuart Brand, especially it's 20 years later or whatever. But that kind of powerful storytelling and telling it in a way that people aren't going to be suspicious of it, that's critical. That's why Greta has been so amazing, right? It's so forceful, genuine. And it's related to design in a way,
Yeah. When architects have in their toolkit, one of the most powerful things that students don't realize they're learning when they're taking their studios is the ability to produce compelling narratives about work in large-scale projects. Working on a huge building is one of the most complex things. You don't design a car when you buy a car, you just buy a car as it is, and a building has all these pieces, and being able to tell a story to convince everybody that you should buy it is an amazing power. And I, as someone who tries to design alternative systems within those buildings, I'm constantly frustrated with the ability of architects to be better at compelling narratives around some larger scale complexities, as we together have experienced in some cases. But I think coming back to the sort of how to insert this narrative or how to rethink or leverage the pledges and commitments, I think reinserting ourselves into a more, architecture is a service, but more service and cycle-oriented thinking around all of our stocks and flows that are surrounding us, that we maintain and are largely linear right now, but don't have to be. And I think designing those is something that you've presented a lot of different pathways toward. Although some of those things may seem very fundamental, I, as someone who does a lot of fundamental research, appreciate, even if it's just mushrooms growing on some wood, at least it's a far way, it's a long ways away from the processes we accept that are in the Embodied Energy book for production of concrete and steel. These things that can actually flow through the environment. But at the same time, coming back to who was it, Stahl's book? There are technical things that we also have to think about addressing. Technical nutrients, as Bill McDonough calls them, right? And maybe, in the context of your work so much on the living side and what he would call biological nutrients, things that have to go back to the environment, how is some of the work on embodied energy and some of the projects, do you envision a pathway for some of these materials that 95% of in this room probably can't be biologically repurposed or reused, but rather to find some technical means to use them again? Do you foresee the mud building example being for like the computer screen, I guess? I'd take that home and let my kids watch cartoons maybe, but there has to be a longer term way to insert some of these cycles, I guess.
Well, for one, regulation.
Yeah.
I think we should all be, requiring our policymakers to do things like require that the manufacturer of that TV take it back at the end of the life and allow it to be separated, sounds simple, but, not using glues and using attachments, which is the whole argument of that building I showed from Design for Disassembly.
Yeah.
But really, getting back to the more, some other frictions that I see. So, right, the architect, can be the storyteller. That's a great theme. The architect can also refuse or pledge or divest or whatever, divest their services. And the architect can continue to challenge and ask questions of the client or, and potentially redesign systems. But I'm afraid of the unintended consequences, but I'm also afraid of the dismissal of expertise and the idea that we would swing so far that we would think, well, actually, we don't need engineers because they're just problem solvers, or they're too technocratic. That's problematic too. So, I don't know. I do think if we're going to try to find the hopeful thing, that I guess still I'm coming back to the pledges, because I think there can be meaning in one's work. Like, we all take meaning in doing a really creative project, and like, wasn't that so great? And it's like fulfilling, and then it can be rewarding once you've done it, to have done it, and it's like inspiring to other people if it's a good project, that kind of thing. But another meaningful thing is just being part of a movement. You know, going to a protest, or, you know, being one of the signatories of something you believe in. Even if it's a sacrifice to yourself, maybe in a way, there can be value in that. And I think looking for those, that's one of the things that I think was really interesting for me, to think about the labor of reconditioning that I was describing from the stale book. It's more interesting labor to repair something than to make it in the first place.
Yeah.
And I think we should look for new kinds of meaning. And you know, along those lines, maybe the last thing I'll say about that is, I was actually really intrigued by a kind of footnote from the architecture lobby's annotation of the Green New Deal resolution, where they said something more or less that, you know, in the original New Deal, there were a lot of architects employed, but they were kind of nameless architects. They were just performing a service, as you described, and they were doing something out of a less, like almost the opposite of our architecture culture of today, which the architecture the architecture lobby criticized as, you know, being projects just for branding. So maybe there's something more of that. I mean, I think it's that kind of change in mindset, that maybe certain projects can be the trigger, biomaterials, or like a new way of thinking about things, a new kind of problem to solve. But it's probably ultimately going to be a new just way of thinking about our own identities that will sustain us through the arguments and debates and challenges.
Yeah, yeah. And I thank you very much for all your comments. And do we have questions still? Or?
I think actually, because of it's a little bit late, and I don't know if these are on, I think that is a kind of perfect way to end tonight and to end this series, which we truly do see not as, you know, certainly ending the overall discussion, but this, what the two of you were just talking about the simultaneous recognition of the humility, which I think actually is a very important idea in all of this, but at the same time, along with that, a sense of what power there is in the professions, in architecture and engineering, and responsibility along with that, that those kind of three ideas together might be a great way to end this series and just put us on, hold those thoughts until we start up again with something, with the next installment sometime in the late winter or spring. So thank you both very, very much. Thank you all for coming, and truly